is the 16th Stitch and Bitch that is part of the National Underwear Audit. It's a project. My name is Coralina Rodriguez Meyer, by the way, and we're here at Perez Art Museum in Miami. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to present the Cunt Quilt and the Stitch and Bitch as part of the My Body, My Rules Performance 4 Ways exhibition. I have an incredible team of speakers, movement leaders in the disability justice movement. And I'm really excited today to introduce the project. As I said, it's the 16th one. And this is part of the National Underwear Audit, which started after the 2016 election. I was in a really rough state emotionally, and I decided, after the election that I would create a national underwear audit to collect worn out women's underwear through the US Postal Service to sew into Cunt Quilts at Stitch and Bitch craft salons. And once we create the Stitch and Bitch with the worn out women's identifying underwear, we then carry the arpilleras or quilts on our backs at protests to demonstrate an intersectional feminist movement. We are performing our citizenship for those who cannot in the ancestral tradition of the various women's labor movements. For example, the Arpilleras Desaparecidos de Chile, where mothers, grandmothers, the loved ones of the disappeared indigenous folks who were erased by the Pinochet dictatorship, the mothers took the remains of their clothing and they stitched them into these arpilleras to create not only memories of their lost loved ones, but also to draw attention to this national crisis in order to let the world know and amplify their message through these protests that they were doing in public squares. This was a very high risk activity because during the dictatorship, many people were in the press were murdered for this. So this kind of dissent through the sort of women's labor and also the craft tradition is central to the project. We're also sort of creating this talking circle to also recall and perform and invoke all of the practices that have happened in North America as well, ranging from the underground railroad quilts all the way to the AIDS quilt. And today we're looking at one of the various aspects of our movement, of our progressive movement, intersectional feminist movement, which is dealing with disability justice. And I'm really excited about this topic because we've actually covered a range of topics over the last 4 years, ranging from environmental justice to LGBTQIA+ visibility, to immigration, and a myriad of other topics. So I'm really excited about this topic today because it is very much a part of my own identity personally, but has really informed the ways in which I approach intersectionality in that, so when I was 20 years old, I was in a motor vehicle accident and I had a traumatic brain injury, which left me in a wheelchair temporarily. It was a very traumatic event, but it was also something that I had to call on my community to help me support. And it makes me want to cry because two of the people that really were central to my recovery are here today. And I'm so deeply moved by their continued support of not only that physical experience, but also of the kind of transcendent power of art to really transform not only my personal life and my identity, but also the ways in which our community creates that kind of restorative justice and can represent others' experiences who can't necessarily articulate what they're going through. So I'm deeply honored to introduce some of the guests today who have gone through their own experiences. I was privileged enough to go through rehabilitation, an incredible program in order to walk and talk again and be here today in the body form that I am. So without further ado, we're going to talk about disability justice. The way we're going to approach this format, which is a kind of hybrid virtual and physical IRL Stitch and Bitch, is we have a queen size bed sheet. We have some underwear that were collected nationally through the US Postal Service. This is a way to engage with democracy, engage with the Postal Service, which was under attack the last few years, as a way to recall and perform our citizenship and to understand how all of these hidden processes can come to light, and really highlight our experiences, especially those that we might be too ashamed to discuss. So the abject nature of the project really relies on kind of humor as well as your participation and you being the audience to create this image and to be the authors and the actors of our democracy. So we're sculpting democracy today. The tools we're using is our debate. We're using tools of trauma recovery. We're using underwear, and we're using our community. And so without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers. I'm so excited about these speakers. They're artists, they're educators, they're activists, they're lawyers, really quite a range. Okay, so we're gonna start off with Victoria Duggar. So one of my favorite quotes from Victoria, I'll start with. It's easy to be overlooked when you don't have a seat at the table, but thankfully I always bring my own chair. And by chair, I believe Victoria is referring to her wheelchair. Victoria Duggar was born in 1991 in Columbus, Georgia. She's calling on us today from Georgia. She's an artist and educator based in Athens, Georgia. She received her BFA in drawing and painting from Columbus State University. She's currently an MFA candidate at the Lamar Dodd School of Art in the University of Georgia, where she is an assistant professor. Her work was recently featured in New American Paintings South Edition. Her solo exhibition, Mind the Body, is currently on view at Linden House Art Center in Athens, Georgia. Victoria's paintings and pedagogy defy the gravity of institutions and art historical stigmas with visceral images of a Black female disabled body that depict her experience. And I'm just gonna run through all of the bios so you can get a sense of who's participating today. And after that, we're going to have each person speak on their projects and their work. Jaklin Romine. Here's another quote I really love from her. So there are three cohesive areas to my practice: idea creation, working in collaboration with art production assistants and performance. And within this dual role as artist and director, I found that the ability to formulate ideas and execute them is not limited to socially constructed ideas of disability. So Jaklin Romine was born in Burbank, California. She currently lives in East LA, which is where she's calling on us from. She studied undergraduate studio arts at Cal State LA and received her MFA from Cal Arts. She received the Rima Hortman Foundation 2019 Emerging Artist Grant for her solo show, Why Bring Me Flowers When I'm Dead? When you had the time to do it when I was alive and living with SCI PSLA in Los Angeles. Oaklee Teal. After acquiring multiple disabilities in her early 20s, Oaklee Teal began utilizing her artistic platform to chronicle life from the disabled perspective. Her work centers on invisible chronic illness, the intimate bond she has formed with her service dog, Coco, and coming to terms with the early deterioration of mind and body. As her health continues to decline, Teal develops custom-made tools to allow her to continue creating large-scale abstract works. In 2020, Teal partnered with Dis Art to create the My Dearest Friends project. It's an international public art collaboration centering disability and COVID-19 through a podcast. Since its inception, MDFP has collected, illustrated, and digitally archived over 300 testimonies from disabled people impacted by COVID-19 across the globe. Matthew Dietz, we've got quite a
I have images here of what she's saying.
Matthew Dietz is the co-founder and litigation director of Disability Independence Group here in Miami. His direct action work in civil rights litigation since 1996 involving the ADA, Fair Housing Act, and laws on behalf of persons with disabilities and others seeking equal rights on the basis of race, color, national origin, gender, age, familial status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Has also provided guidelines to the Florida bar to accommodate persons with disabilities in Florida courts. He's done a tremendous amount of work, for which he's been awarded the Haas Humanitarian Award, the American Bar Association's Hearn Award, and has just an exemplary career of being an incredible ally to the disability justice community. Elia Khalaf, who's here with us physically, is a psychotherapist and community-based artist, positioning his work at the intersection between art, wellness, justice, social justice, mental health, while exploring creativity as a tool for healing individually and collectively. In 2009, Elia earned his master's in art therapy and mental health counseling at NYU. And his latest project, Side by Side, is a mail art program for neighboring kids in Miami and a winner of the Ellie's Creator Award. He's currently an artist psychotherapist for oncology supportive care services at University of Miami Sylvester Comprehensive Center. He'll be leading the image making discussion along with myself, Andrea, and Kevin. Kevin is a founder and director of Knead Creative and senior branding at Saatchi & Saatchi. After receiving his BFA in 2005 from Cooper Union, the Jamaican, Miami and NYC-based multimedia artist founded Knead Creative. It's a design agency that nurtures the artistic community and social entrepreneurship. His work as a production designer for short films and theatrical features has received awards from HBO, BET, and Sundance. We spent more than half our lives together in NYC and Miami, along with Andrea, growing up here in the tropics, the sweaty tropics together. Andrea Preston, this is off the cuff, is an incredible educator. She started one of the most influential high schools in Miami called Miami Arts Charter as the visual arts director and co-founder. She is currently an educator in a K through 12 private school, one of the top schools in the country, American Heritage. She has just been committed to education her entire professional career, is a dedicated mother of 2 beautiful children, and just an incredible creative person, ranging from musical production and songwriting to visual art. She's an incredible portrait painter, and actually painted a portrait of one of the artists from Miami that we'll be talking about later today. And that portrait disappeared, much like the folks that we're calling on today, but she's just an incredible creative here today, and I'm really honored to introduce everyone. So thank you so much. That was a mouthful. So I'm gonna jump right into the questions so that we can hear from these incredible speakers. So we're gonna start off with Victoria, actually. Victoria, if you can unmute yourself. I just wanna get you started. Each one's gonna go through about 5 or so minutes of just talking about your practice and what it is that's really important to you, and why we're here today talking about your work. So off to you, Victoria.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Coralina, for having me. Thank you to the Perez Art Museum. I really appreciate you asking me to be here. Yeah, so my work stems from, my lived experience with disability. I was disabled at a very young age, at the age of 3, from a surgery, actually. So I was previously walking, and then the surgery paralyzed me. So it was definitely, what's the word? A curveball for me and my family. But they, having such a great support system, and my family really, stepping up, because I think with disability, it's almost always seen societally as individual based, but it really does kind of permeate the family and permeate the community. If you know someone with a disability, you might not have the disability yourself, but you can always kind of it's a relation tool, I think, as well in the community. So my work mainly stems from my disability and my lived experience, and also kind of the expansion of it into my family as well. And again, I'm a Black female, female identifying, and so that kind of plays into my work as well. That kind of marginalized. I'm kind of marginalized in a lot of areas through my Blackness or my female identity, my gender, of course, and then, with my disability. And so my work kind of course, comes from that lived experience, but also I think um, it's I'm aiming for it to be a critique on, the um, societal aspect of disability, which I think is, what we're all here to do today is really kind of shine a light on society and saying, hey, disability isn't, an individual thing. It really affects the community and the society and how we respond to disability. So yeah, so what a great segue. So this is a painting I did last year called Painting the Roses Red, where I kind of emulated the Mona Lisa and really kind of inserting myself into spaces, the space of art history, the space of, the art historical canon, where where myself and people like me have kind of statistically been excluded. So the title of this work actually comes from Alice in Wonderland from Disney. There's this kind of really poignant scene where the Red Queen is telling everyone to paint the white roses red, and a lot of my work kind of stems from um, societal's goal to kind of the destruction of nature, and I kind of juxtapose that alongside this kind of um, controlling aspect of disability and or abnormality into a quote unquote normality. So I thought this was kind of poignant to kind of name this piece that. So this piece again kind of deals with this kind of scenic portraiture. There's some exposed guts from a gut print I made from printmaking. And this is kind of more so, dealing with the idea of like, as a person with a disability who has lived with a disability my whole life, basically, I really wish that people would look inward, and of course, access um, what I look like on the outside, but really kind of see me with more empathy than I think, societally that we're taught to observe and encounter people. So the next piece. So this piece is kind of, I've had a lot of surgeries in my life, and this piece in particular kind of came out of a lot of pain and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I guess unhappiness or instability of thinking about my disabled body and 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 thinking about kind of the spontaneity of a disabled body. I think is something really interesting that you kind of have to live with, that you kind of have to get used to, and things like that can be of course challenging, but on the positive side of that, I think it causes us to be more creative. I think disabled people are oftentimes very creative in thinking about, oh, I'm not going to go that way to get to the supermarket. I'm going to go this way, or just adapting, I think is a very creative characteristic that disability helps summon. So this piece kind of has those um, lollipops you get as a child at the doctor's office. So kind of just juxtaposing again this silhouetted figure with these really emotional eyes. And then I think the next piece, yes, thank you. So this piece is really kind of just an exploration of um, organs and things that really make us up, you know. I think oftentimes, you know, as people, you know, we get caught up with not recognizing someone else's humanity. So I think the organs are kind of something that relate us all. So I was kind of doing this more exploration of these morphing and changing aspects of that as alongside taking into the perfect pattern or a normality set design and playing with those disruptions, I would say, which I think is um, something that can be um, considered next to disability.
I mean, those are such incredibly powerful images, Victoria. And thank you so much. I mean, I think your insight, it's really funny seeing them again. I'm actually thinking a lot about the viscera and the kind of physicality of what we have to deal with and the processes of our body, and how those you know, can be unpleasant or things that we're ashamed of. And kind of, I think your expression of stigma and creating these alternative sort of refuge for the viewer is really quite inspiring. I think so. Jaklin's work, I think similarly, I think she's dealing with the kind of viscera of public space in a really interesting way. I think one of the works, Jaklin, that I really enjoyed with your performance series was this visible invisibility. And so, Jaklin, if you can just kind of talk a little bit about that project, but also in the context of your experiences, you know, I think with the legal system and kind of negotiating that, and also the visual arts, the institutional system. I mean, you just have an incredibly voracious activist practice along with your performance and artwork. So yeah, I'm excited to share that and hear more about that.
So yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Jaklin Romine. I am a living, working, disabled, queer, Latinx artist who is talking to you on Chumash land in Los Angeles. And I am, my project that you were speaking about, visibly invisible, is about my experience early on being a disabled person and a young disabled person. I became disabled when I was 21 and I'm now 35. And when I was working on this project, it was about 10 years ago when I was still coming to terms with my disability and the experience of being a disabled person in public space. Most people don't know this because they don't have to experience this, but when a disabled person enters into a space, everybody looks at them. Everybody, either they want to, or either they're doing it on purpose, or they're doing it just because they are noticing something different in the room. And when you come into that space, you become immediately visible. And then because of the recognition of your body in that space, people are looking at you as a you know, as a foreign object in that space, and then they immediately turn away their gaze because they don't want to be recognized for staring at you, and they immediately make you invisible. So this is a recognition of that experience where I inserted myself into a public space in a in a bar, and I was immediately still, and I allowed the other people to continue to act in that space as they would, and I became still, and everybody became blurry.
Yeah. No, I think that's incredible. And maybe if you can just quickly speak to as well, if I may, bridge this performance work that, you know, for the most part, you're engaging much smaller sort of mom and pop, I think is what you called it, places where we might hang out. But you're also, in terms of direct action, you know, you've had this tremendous experience in litigation, in having to follow through with your court case on so many levels with not only, you know, the car companies, but you've also taken on the university systems legally. So, I mean, if you can speak a little bit more to kind of what it's been like to kind of balance that, you know, taking on that labor, you know, both emotionally as well as legally, alongside, you know, how that's impacted your visual arts practice.
Yeah, for sure. So as a person with a disability, going into grad school, I went to grad school at Cal Arts. I didn't want to have to make work about my disability. I didn't want that to be the focus of my art practice, but the institution forced me to. The institution forced me to by continuously discriminating against me, even on my interview day. On my interview day, I couldn't access the photo lab, which I have my master's in photo media from Cal Arts, and I specifically got accepted and was asked to go there for photo media. And on my interview day, I couldn't access the bathroom on the basement floor of the photo lab area because it was labeled handicap accessible, and then it was not accessible. I could not access the stall and close the door behind my body. The door was still open. And the photo lab, I couldn't physically open the door. And even until this day, the photo lab darkroom interior is still not handicap accessible, and it wasn't accessible when I was there either. And so because of that first experience, I had, like, you know, talks with the faculty on campus, and with hopes that when I would come to school, if I were to be accepted, that it would be accessible by the time I went to school. And I was led to believe that that was going to happen. And when I showed up to school, did not happen. And so from the first few days, first 3 weeks of school, I was asking for access. Actually, before I even came to the school, I was asking for access. And they told me that if I was going to be accepted into the school and I was going to pay as much as everybody else, I should be allowed to use every bathroom on campus just like everybody else. But that was not true. So every single day that I was there, I was being discriminated against because all the bathrooms that were in front of the access elevator were labeled handicap accessible, but they were not physically accessible to the disabled body. And 3 of them still are not accessible. So because of this situation and because of this continued experience, I pushed back against the school and I sued the school for their inaccessibility. And we settled out of court with the agreement that they would fix most of the inaccessible locations, the bathrooms, different ramps, while on campus, so that it would be not only accessible for myself, but for other people. And yeah, so because of that experience, I took a lot of documentation of the different inaccessible locations on campus, and I used some of that documentation in my thesis exhibition at school for a project that was called I Am Here. I used pictures of my wheelchairs set on fire. It's on my website as well if you guys want to pull it up while I'm talking. And I have documentation of the different inaccessible locations at Cal Arts. And I took pictures of, I got fake tattoos made of all the derogatory terms that are used for somebody with a disability. And I put them all over my body, and I took pictures of them. I took pictures of myself with that outfit on, and all of this work was in the same space altogether. And I printed all of these pictures on vinyl and vinyl banners that are 3 by 6 and go all the way 3 by 8 feet. So when I was, and so that's the visual art practice that I started to build based off of experiences in photography that I would create and create with other artists as well. Okay.
That's incredible. I mean, it's just such a tremendous undertaking. And yeah, I mean, we'll kind of talk about that duality in more detail of, you know, how you're balancing kind of this private inner world of the legal system and the body and your artwork. Oaklee Teal, I think, is also sort of negotiating these multiple worlds in her work in incredible ways. I think in particular that's sort of interesting that I think we're seeing a lot more today is, you know, the service dog, and I think we'll kind of go in more. Maybe Matthew will talk a little bit about this later, about this notion of, you know, a service dog, a medical support dog versus an emotional support dog. But I think what's interesting about your investigation into that, Oaklee, is that, you know, you're calling on your community in these different ways through your My Dearest Friends Project podcast that documents, you know, disabled people's experiences during COVID. And so I think what's interesting is you're giving voice to people who may not express themselves the way we do as visual or sound artists, I guess, in this case. And in some ways, you're also giving voice to your dog as well, and kind of that relationship, which is really, so it's really moving. So if you could talk a little bit about that work and kind of your arc, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Oaklee Thiele. I am a white female with short brown hair. I am wearing a blue artist apron, fingerless gray gloves, and I'm sitting in front of a blank white wall. I'm an artist and disability activist, currently getting my BFA at the Cooper Union in New York City. And as you previously mentioned, I create a lot of work around my relationship with my service dog, Coco. So I've been creating large-scale canvas paintings for several years now. I never stretch these canvases because it's easier to transport, and also I really like the organic shape that the fabric makes. So I don't know if there's imagery. Can I share my screen, or are you guys able to pull that up?
We're gonna fix it in a second.
Okay, I'll keep going. So eventually we will share an image that I have of, it'll feature my medical alert service dog, Coco. And when I went to several appointments at Johns Hopkins since the start of the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, I was not allowed to bring anyone with me. So I had no family or friend support during those appointments, but I was able to have my medical alert service dog with me. So that brought a lot of comfort in being able to have that companion. And also, as I was mentioned before as well, because of my health, I have had to make custom tools to be able to continue working with the chronic pain and the fatigue that I have. So I use a combination of like wooden rods, tape, clay, and I use those to attach them together to paintbrushes and okay, cool. So this is the painting that I was talking about earlier with my medical alert service dog, Coco. And then beside it are some of the custom tools that I use to create the work. Can you go to the next slide, please? Awesome, thank you. So around this time last year, my hometown began experiencing the ramifications of COVID-19 firsthand. So I was reading these headlines and listening to family and friends saying, you know, don't worry, only the old and disabled and chronically ill will die from this, which is such a terrible thing. And that was me. They were talking about me. I am a disabled person at high risk, and they were talking as if my life meant nothing. And that's when Disart, an arts and cultural nonprofit, reached out to me to collaborate. So our disability community was experiencing, and it still is experiencing, so much pain during this pandemic. Our medical needs are being ignored in the name of triage. And Disart and I felt this great need to speak up about it. So we co-created the Dearest Friends Project, which is a global art collaboration that aims to document the disability community's collective experience with the COVID-19 pandemic through illustrations, written testimonies, and podcasts. So I wrote the first My Dearest Friends poem, which is featured right here on the left. And it became the foundation for this project. We've posted this poem publicly and have asked disabled individuals to reply in the same format. So far we have collected over 350 stories, and I create a custom illustration for each and every story that we receive. So they're like completely covering the wall of my studio right now. You can kind of, this is like a few weeks on the right is an image of the Dearest Friends project, only a few weeks in. And you can see a bunch of charcoal drawings featuring disabled people and their stories. And so it's still continuing today. If you can go to the next slide, please. It's still continuing today. And it's really served as a platform for marginalized voices and has been our way of finding solace and community during the pandemic. So you can find this project at the My Dearest Friends project on Instagram. And yeah, next slide, please. So in the fall, I ended up moving to New York City, and my chronic health issues had worsened to the point where my PT recommended that I start using a cane. So that was an especially vulnerable moment for me because I mean, I'm a freshman in college trying to navigate this new city, trying to make friends, but I'm also attempting to come to terms with my disability and my new need for a mobility aid. And it was also the time that I became really fascinated by the signs in New York City, all the banners and the billboards. So as a disabled person, our right to exist freely and unapologetically is never guaranteed. I wanted to take up space and I wanted to take up lots of space. So I wanted to declare publicly, loudly, boldly that, you know, I'm disabled and I'm proud and I'm happy. So this was the first banner that I installed in New York City. It's kind of glitching out on the slide, but that's okay. It reads, in all of my years, this is the happiest I have ever been, and they said it wouldn't be. And it's anchored down inside of the building using the cane that I currently use. And if you can go to the next slide, this is my last and final slide. Thank you. I'd call this one more of a performance. A few weeks ago, I actually had a doctor in New York City tell me in many words that New York City is too inaccessible for disabled people who use mobility aids. So I shouldn't use mobility aid, I should just go without one, which was a very ableist and dangerous statement to say. So with help, I carried this banner from my dorm through the subway system, up several flights of stairs, and I installed it outside across the street from her clinic. And I sat beside it for as long as I was able to. And this sign, it reads, "You told me New York City isn't accessible, but you're forgetting that I'm a disability activist and I'll just make New York City accessible."
Yeah, I mean, what an incredibly powerful practice. And I love that you're also schlepping these massive banners, much the way that these Cunt Quilts are carried through the streets. And actually, that's a really interesting, you know, point that you're bringing up as we kind of transition to Matthew's work, because I know that in some of the conversations we've had, you know, it's come up a few times about, you know, how inaccessible protest has been, you know, and how difficult it is for some folks to even just be able to go down the street. And, you know, for example, the first Women's March in DC, there were just so many roads blocked off, and it really makes you have a different perspective on sort of what are the ways in which we as a public can engage with dissent and build our democracy, because there really are so many different practices going on and that are making direct impact. And so protest is one, but there's also, you know, in the legal system, Matthew, if you can talk a little bit about, you know, maybe some of the large adjustments in terms of policy that have happened, and really the kind of work that you're doing with Disability Independence Group, which is just this credible organization you founded. And yeah, just maybe some of the anecdotes and stories that you're excited about representing.
Great. Hi, my name is Matthew Dietz. I'm a 50-year-old white male wearing a grayish green shirt and a short gray beard. Well, let's start out how I started doing this and why I believed it was important. There are approximately 20% of the population of the US are people with disabilities. And as a lawyer that practices disability rights law, I've learned that it is difficult to get justice for my clients unless they're people that understand or look like them, that are judges in the jury, because the disability rights laws is based upon reasonableness. And if you've never met a person with a disability, you really can't understand what reasonableness could be. And starting in 2002, I started with the Florida Bar to identify and survey the membership to determine what the needs are of people with disabilities within my profession itself. And understanding that once the legal system reflects the general population and understands disability, then justice will be increased for those that live with disabilities and that get help from our system. Now, I don't know if you're going to put the video in, Coralina, or how you're going to do that.
Yeah, we'll try to get that going, and we'll try to play it without sound. So if folks, I believe it has closed captioning, so that will help compensate for the lack of sound, if that's okay. But you can keep talking, Matthew.
Sure. So when we talk about disability, it is a broad systemic issue in dealing both with the intersectionality with a multi-marginalized community. And if we could just talk about one issue, it's impossible because there are so many people with disabilities out there. So when we talk about, for example, access to reproductive care, and the fact that many medical offices do not have accessible equipment. When we talk about issues such as, okay, let's see what's on the screen. Okay, let me change for a second. This is the Black Lives Matter protest, and here is Carrie Gray, who's an activist, an African-American disability activist, who is saying their names, the women and men, African-American women and men who have been victims of police and who've died under police misconduct. And in this video, we have Ben Crump, who's a noted civil rights attorney who represents a lot of these folks, and a sign language interpreter signing what Ben Crump is saying about it's important to sign their names and say their names, because most people who are involved with police misconduct not only are there because of racial or gender issues, but also because of their disabilities. And a lot of the victims of police misconduct have been people with disabilities. And when Ben says when racism and ableism combine, the result is another tragedy. So these are the issues that we must be looking into when we discuss race, gender, and disabilities. So here Ben is speaking the names of the victims of police brutality while the interpreter is signing the names of each person. Now, as they do that, I'll talk about some other issues that arise. For example, the issue for domestic violence in persons with disabilities is a major issue in society today. The facts are that there are at least 4 times greater the amount of women with disabilities that get abused than women without disabilities. And the issue on that is
We're about to transition.
there is issues involving both dependence and ability to communicate for women that have disabilities. Let me give you an example. I had one client who wanted to go to a women's health center to get an abortion, and her boyfriend went with her. My client was deaf and her boyfriend was hearing. The women's health clinic refused to get an interpreter for her. So her boyfriend ended up speaking for her. She did not understand what was happening. She didn't understand what choices she had. She didn't understand what procedures they were doing. It was all through the understanding and what her boyfriend chose to interpret for her. That was not appropriate. And we ended up suing on that to ensure that they made sure that their clinic would always have a sign language interpreter upon demand. The same thing happens very often as well in hospitals. To the extent that a person comes to a hospital with an injury, and the person may be a victim of domestic violence, usually a hospital does a interpersonal violence assessment, where that person is evaluated as to whether or not they're a victim of domestic violence if they do have injuries that could be attributed to it. If you don't have an interpreter, you do not have that access. Now, it's not always folks that have communication disabilities, it's also other disabilities as well. One of the major barriers that I've seen for persons in using domestic violence shelters is often domestic violence shelters have rules that prohibit animals or prohibit people that administer their own medication. So if a person needs to administer themselves a shot of medication, they may not be admitted. If a person needs to go to a domestic violence shelter and has a service animal or an emotional support animal, they may be denied. I actually had a client who decided to stay with her abuser rather than go to a domestic violence shelter because she did not want to either leave her animal with her abuser, or she did not want to be homeless with her animal. So she decided to stay with her abuser rather than getting the help that she needed. So when you look at these issues, and it also is maybe an issue as that should be as simple as having an accessible bathroom. The fact that you go to a medical clinic or to a domestic violence shelter and you do not have an accessible bathroom is a barrier, is as much of a barrier to saying you can't have your medication here, or you cannot bring your service animal in. So these things are not only things that happen in cities like Miami, but these are things that happen throughout, because as when I was discussing in the first place, how the justice system doesn't, unless you have lawyers that understand the lived experiences of persons with disabilities, you're really not going to have an effective justice system. In the same way, without having doctors, without having folks in domestic violence shelters, without having educators that understand the needs of persons with disabilities and how to modify their programs. Because when we talk about the legal structure of the ADA, we're talking about how to accommodate or modify programs or modify the built environment to be accessible for persons with disabilities. And how we do that is we have an understanding of lived experiences, and we have an understanding what the needs of persons are by welcoming people into our groups, our families, our societies, and giving them an equal right to be a part. Thank you, Coralina. Is there anything else you want me to address?
Well, you brought up so many points, and I think, the earlier speakers overlap with so many of these issues in interesting ways. I mean, we really could have a whole conference on this topic, which maybe one day PAMM will consider. I think, just for the purposes of time, as we kind of wrap up our first segment of this first hour, I just want to remind everyone, that a lot of what you're talking about is creating visibility and is fostering community, because actually it's like sometimes we forget that the legal system is really just an amp. It's a way to amplify what's actually going on in the community. And so, as you were saying, it's really interesting to think about how judges see people and who actually is visible. And, just to kind of start arcing into the second half, I think we should definitely think about that. I think these questions of who's visible, who is integrated, because really we're talking about segregation. I mean, one of the things that was so just startling to me when I was doing research for this, one of the data points you brought up, 1 in 5 people are disabled. That's the largest minority group in the United States. Almost all, I think, Matthew, you can correct this point, almost all of the laws that were created during the civil rights movement don't apply for disabled people. For example, separate but equal is still okay, according to the US law. It's still okay to segregate, for example, children who need to be picked up by a bus. They're segregated on their own short bus, it's called. And often in many schools, we still have an institutionalized, disabled care system. You can't, let's say, for a lot of folks, you can't just be in your home and receive care or go to school with all the other kids. So oftentimes you're segregated into these other experiences. And then I kind of bring up another one that I learned recently that I was shocked by, was that minimum wage doesn't apply to disabled people. I mean, that just blew my mind. I was like, we've been fighting for this for so long. And how could you just skip over this entire population? And so, again, disabled people represent all of the other intersections. And so I just wanted to kind of call on some of those facts as we transition into this kind of narrative storytelling component. We do have some physical IRL participants here in the audience, and we have folks virtually in the audience. So I would just like to encourage folks, as we transition for the next hour, we're going to be creating a new quilt based on the conversations that we've had today. So really the key to this is your participation, whether it's physically coming over, drawing, sketching ideas, writing words or themes that have struck you during the conversation today. And in the chat, I encourage those who are participating virtually to ask questions. I mean, we have these experts, we have these incredible speakers here that hopefully can clarify some of these ideas. I mean, I know I love crowdsourcing, so this is all about crowdsourcing. We're going to then create an image based on, we have some inspiration images here that Kevin's going to share in a minute. And yeah, so I encourage folks, if there's photographs, if you see logos, slogans, icons that just make you think of these issues, feel free to share them in the chat. You can share that with a link to the image if you pull it offline. Kevin, if you want to go ahead and start screen sharing. I mean, I think one of the things that we're also going to call on is Elia's expertise here, because you know, I think one of the things we talked about, Elia, is you know, temporary disability or unseen disabilities. And so, you know, maybe if you can usher us into this next segment and maybe walk us through some of the kind of art therapy tools that might be useful for us today that you employ with some of your oncology patients. And yeah, just maybe talk a little bit about your work and how we can translate that to a new image that we're creating today as a group.
Sure, that sounds really good. I think there's been so much ideas that are so interesting and impactful. Not sure if everybody can hear me okay. I think the voice just kicked in. So I would like to start with the fact that you shared that 1 in 5 people are diagnosed to have a disability. And I think there's a key element that we don't consider often, which is that diagnosis is made and centered around a white perspective. And again, that's the idea of intersectionality. Working at a hospital, I think that comes up a lot. Oftentimes, I work at a cancer hospital, and oftentimes people have their conceptions about who patients are and what they look like. And I think, you know, in general, as a culture, as a society, we tend to be rigid in our perspectives. We tend to assume that if you're a cancer patient, that you're just coming into oncology. But the matter and the reality of the experience is that oftentimes people come in with other issues. I work with patients who are deaf. I work with patients who also have some issues with visual impairment. So there's this intersectionality that is, I think, really important to highlight. And as a therapist, I like the idea of working on 2 fronts, of having a private practice where I work directly with patients and survivors, but also the idea of having a public practice, which I think resonates with what we're doing here today, how mental health is really a pivotal part of our lives, how the stories that we tell collectively impact our mental health. So those are some key concepts that I work on individually with people, recreating their narrative, restoring their lives after trauma, but that's something we can do today collectively as well. I wanted to also mention that I'm a new citizen, so I'm so excited to perform my new citizenship today as an Arab American. And then the next thing that comes to my mind is how to go forward after trauma. And I think there's the sensory component that we're using today. The materials that we're using textiles. We're using something that's based on a sense of touch and a sense of sensory positive stimulation. And hopefully that will assist us in terms of reprocessing some of that trauma that we experience collectively and individually as well. So that's a little bit of art therapy in a nutshell, but I'm excited to see what we explore, what comes about, and if there's any questions that come up as well.
Yeah, and Kevin, are you seeing any, and I guess, yeah, I'll kind of flip it over to Kevin for a second, and, you know, maybe you can speak to what is the, you know, best way for us to process these images, to think about how to critique them and how to draw our own conclusions and draw our own image, you know, by the end of this hour, which is going to be a big challenge in this design charrette.
Yeah, it's kind of a really intense design sprint that we're about to go on right now. So we're going to kind of break this down into a good 20-minute sections, 3 20-minute sections. So the first 20 minutes, we're going to take all the ideas we kind of heard today and just like coalesce them so we can like synthesize them down into like a set, like one unique set of words, right? Then the second one, we're going to look at all the images and see how these images that we've gathered here today and the images that our crowd is going to help us gather, how they align with some of the themes that we've been coming up with. And then the final thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take these images and try to collect them into things that are visually iconic. Coralina's process, where she goes ahead and takes the garments and assembles them into these different images, the pixels are really, really big. So instead of thinking of things that seem like illustrations, we want to drift our minds towards things that seem kind of iconic, because these are very large pixels, right? So that's kind of what we're going to go after. So so on my list, some of the words that I've heard a lot today was things like integration, things like visibility, things like ability. I know Cora also has a list of words that you've been coming up with. What are some of the words that you have on your list, Cora?
I think, for example, Jaklin, thinking about slurs, you know, what are some of the derogatory things, you know, some of the more unpleasant
Slurs.
things that we hear, you know, either at a protest or just walking or rolling down the street, you know, I think there's definitely this line between intimacy and the public that, you know, we can reconsider. You know, I think trauma is one. I think the idea of different perspectives, you know, that there are just so many ways to think about what
Trauma.
Disability is, what's actually seen, what's not seen, what's hidden. I think, I think also containment, you know, how do we contain these issues and how are they breaking out of these institutionalized sort of structures? So I think family, community, these are all just phrases that have come up in the last hour, but yeah, I encourage anyone who's participating virtually or physically, you know, this is really a good time. I guess I would just encourage folks, if you're interested in participating, we have this nice sort of sketch pad on the table. If there's been anything that you've heard today or seen that has struck you in any way, I would love for you to either write down a word that you know helps you to recall either this experience or other experiences with disability issues, and it can be your own, it can be someone in your family. I mean, I think one thing that's become very clear even about the data is just that we all know somebody who is managing or perhaps struggling with, you know, some level of disability. So yeah, the more folks that get involved and sketch and draw, I know we have some real artists in the audience, visual artists. We have some performers, theater background people. We got all kinds of resources here. So this project is all about kind of bringing that in and, you know, jumping in hands on deck. Yeah, we'll definitely encourage folks as you feel comfortable to come up and engage. It can be words, it can be images, just anything. And I think also what Kevin will do shortly in a minute is also pull up these inspiration images, which the speakers earlier have dropped in images. I culled up some images that, you know, things that we just see, the visual ephemera of this issue. For example, I know at protests, I see a lot of signs, t-shirts, pins. There's logos, you know, I think with social media, we have a lot of visual influences that really come from the culture. So I'm just excited about sharing those with you. And yeah, if any folks have any suggestions or questions, if you can kind of see here, Kevin is sharing here on the screen. We have some images. So stop there, Perez Young, pregnant lady with halo. This painting was made circa 1995. It's a paint and collage on corrugated board. So Perez Young is an incredible artist from Miami who's no longer with us. Textured and colorful life. I think Andrea actually is somewhat of an expert because she was good friends with him and painted a portrait of Perez Young. He is a person who lived with disabilities and really struggled in the art world as well as sort of existing in the world at large to continue being an artist. I mean, he was so prolific as a painter. I think he's one of the most influential, what would be called formally outsider artists. I think that term is under question. But yeah, maybe Andrea, if you can speak to kind of his work and kind of how that might influence what we're thinking about today.
My interaction with Perez Young was basically between 2005 to 2008, 9, and I worked with him in the studio, helping to archive his paintings, and I basically saw how firsthand.
All right, so I'm gonna ask you to help me grab the reins to kind of move it.
Ownership over his studio played a role of a caregiver and at the same time took advantage of him. And that was really sad to see. I watched the deterioration of his body with diabetes and losing the ability to walk, losing his sight. And I saw how the manager at the time, you know, provided this care that he needed, but also slowly started to take ownership of his works and eventually claimed ownership over a warehouse that had over 1,500 paintings in it. And then it ended in a lawsuit. And there's been a lot of debate about who really was there for him. And a lot of people took advantage of him because of his, I think, purity. You know, he continued to paint no matter what. He used paints from Home Depot. He had the local homeless guys go and gather the leftover paints, and he collected wood pallets, and he just painted every day. He watched the news and he translated his emotional reactions into his work. And you know, some people were I think honest and sincere, and others took advantage of him. But the disability eventually, unfortunately, you know, brought him to an early death. And even after his death, there was a lot of fight over his estate and the value of his work that is still being debated with lawyers. So,
what do you think are some of the themes that sorry about this. What do you think are some of the themes that that his work addresses as far as disability goes?
I would say that you know, people talk about a poet as being somebody who reflects back to society what society is experiencing, and I think that's how he was. So I feel like he pretty much spanned all issues. So he would wake up every day, watch the news, and translate what he was seeing into his paintings. And it would go, you know, it could be civil rights, it could be disease, it could be economic disparity. It was everything, and it wasn't just national, it was global. So I think, you know, in his personal life, issues of race, you know, economic inequality, watching the demise of Overtown. I mean, he stayed in Overtown when a lot of people left, and he dedicated his life trying to make Overtown better and to take care of, he had a girlfriend that had 4 kids, and he took care of them as best he could. And so his personal life was probably more rooted in that, but I think his work spanned a lot of things. So I feel like, you know, as you guys were talking.
Oh, yeah. You also have a bunch of other words from the.
To transition back to the issues today, I think in a nutshell, being invisible and visible. I mean, he experienced that all the time, you know, people. Invisible. Yeah, that stood out to me a lot. Jaklin Romine brought that up because, and then I also think Oaklee as well, that they have to present themselves, they have to have the courage to face that stare all the time, and then they have to also face losing the connection. You know, people, they're almost there to help, but they're not, and like, who's gonna keep fighting for that? Which I thought was amazing what Matthew Dietz brought up.
Wait, sorry, I didn't hear that last one. Another word you had there?
No, so there's a few different topics here, but I thought the invisible was something that was really stood out to me. I thought in Victoria Duggar's work that the idea that she's been dealing with this since she was such a young person, so that she had to have the experience of being disabled as a child, as an adolescent, as a teenager. So I think like
maybe like the theme of endurance or a marathon, because like it's a lifelong. I don't know if struggle is the right word, but it's a lifelong obstacle.
Right.
What word am I kind of getting at here? Not struggle, not obstacle. I think challenge. Yeah.
So Jaklin mentioned that too. She said, I didn't want
challenge is a good word.
Make my art about my disability, but I was forced to. So in all these situations, they're forced to fight, or else not have access. So we look at it as courageous, but there's no choice there. So I think maybe the resilience, the fighting, and
Resilience is a good word.
the creativity. I think it was Victoria that mentioned that. The spontaneity, I liked that word that she associated with having to be adaptable to different situations. Like she has to constantly adapt and find some other resourceful way of dealing with a situation.
I'm sort of going through this this document here where we have images. You know, I think what's exciting about the work of the artists that we saw today is really that what a transformation it's been. And I know, Elia, you have a lot of knowledge in terms of the kind of art historical background as well of the disability rights movement. I mean, obviously, these are images from protests and actual protest signs. But I mean, really look at the ways in which this has been portrayed historically.
Yeah.
It's shocking. I mean, Peter Bruegel, The Beggars, 1568. I mean, you know, the way that our society has really just completely repositioned our storytelling and who gets represented.
Right, and who tells those stories? Because I think oftentimes the painters telling that story reflected society's perspectives on those different eras. And now people are being the authors of their own stories. At least that's the hope that we want to work towards, re-authoring and being our own authors.
Yeah, I mean, even Velázquez, Las Meninas, I mean, what a famous painting. You know, but we seldom think about how that, you know, what are even the aspects of the folks who are disabled in this painting. You know, the gaze is certainly important here.
Well, I think there's, if I remember correctly, in Las Meninas, you can see a reflection of the artist too, of Velázquez is in the mirror.
Exactly.
And I think it goes with what we're saying about perspective and who's telling the story.
Right. And Kliges Kluppel, War Cripples, Otto Dix, 1920 baseline we have to critique here. I mean, I think Übermensch, a lot of folks have problems with this sculpture by Jake and Dinos Chapman. I mean, some of their work is humorous and kitsch. I mean, they're dealing with kind of this exaggerated version, you know, of the issue. You know, and we forget sometimes about how important figures may have been dealing with these hidden disabilities, you know, because they had to pass, you know, and how passing is such an important part of you know, what gets hidden and what is seen. Horace Pippin, incredible amount of work. David Holt, that's a portrait of Basquiat. And, you know, I mean, the freak shows, I mean, some, you know, thinking about the paintings in the visual ephemera, Orlan, jumping in, you know, what we're doing now is we're collecting words. I guess I'll go over and read some of the words there. And Kevin, maybe you can speak to some of the logos and stuff that we're seeing there on the screen share.
Themes that's kind of emerged so far. I'm going to say all the themes that we have so far, and then I'm going to need the audience to kind of help me coalesce all these different ones into the ones that we feel are the most primal for this particular discussion. So we have words like slurs, trauma, reflect, society, taking care of oneself in the city, the visible, the invisible, stare, gaze, surveillance. Again, it's all about being seen, who isn't. Words like endurance, challenge, force, fight, agency, resilience, creativity, spontaneity. Do you guys feel do you guys here in the audience or our audience digitally, do you guys feel there's any words or themes that's been left out that should be included in this discussion? So I'll open it up. And in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen so we can all have a look at the words that we have so far.
Some folks have drawn some images and words here. What if our goal was well-being of the earth and its peoples? Hashtag sign their names. Environmental racism. I mean, I think Yeah, I mean, these are definitely intersecting with so many issues. They're really inseparable. I mean, Kevin, even pollution, lack of green space, safety, parks, advocate. That's a big one, I think. Sorry, advocate. Access with respect, dare, look away, visible, invisible, accessibility to healthy food, companion, healing, largest minority population, 1 in 5. In my day, in the 50s, there were no disabled students. You were just labeled bad. Wow, that gives me chills. I mean, if we think about just how much the stigma has transformed over such a short period of time, or long, I mean, depending on where you are in that struggle, I mean, it's incredible. Judy Heumann, who I encourage everyone, if you go to the blog post I wrote about today, there's a list of resources that everyone can kind of use in case you want to become more involved in this issue. I encourage everyone to check out the artist website that we had featured today from the various artists, but also Disability Independence Group. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage everyone to see the movie Crip Camp on Netflix. I mean, how do you, it's a documentary film that basically chronicles Judy Heumann and all of her activist colleagues who started the movement, which eventually brought the ADA. And it's such an incredible story because, you know, it really establishes the visual culture that was so hidden for so long. And I think speaking to sort of this comment by the audience of, you know, that, yeah, in the 1950s, I mean, we still had an institutionalized medical system. So people were literally corralled into these buildings off away from everybody else and everybody's society. So, I mean, I think just to kind of arc us back into the exercise here, I'll sort of point to the screen here that Kevin's pulled up. I mean, these are some of the language that we've discussed today, and these words really build out our culture. And I'm just curious, you know, if anyone either in the virtual or physical audience, you know, is there anything here that you would fight for? Is there a word here that really just feels like it's hitting on the vein of this topic in a kind of transgressive way? Or is there a word on here that makes you feel like really conflicted about this?
I'm going to say that these are enough for this part of the session. But let's try to like figure out which 3 or 4 words we think are probably like the most primal words for this topic. Spontaneity, I'm going to make that one low priority. So spontaneity, I'm going to bump that one down. I'm just going to go ahead and start looking at images while keeping all these words in mind. It's going to be a little bit harder because it's kind of a community of thought instead of like one singular thought. But just to help us get to the design portion of the thing, we're just going to dive in. So let's have a look at the images.
Kevin, can you, before you do that, can we add destigmatize? Noel just
destigmatize. That's a great word.
Jumped in. I think that was a good addition.
Destigmatize. Add that one. And destigmatize. So let's take a look at the images, and then we will.
It's really a great drawing here.
So we were talking here about the person, or do you mind sharing with us like what you drew and how you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, so the audience member just sketched this really beautiful drawing of what appears to be 5 figures, maybe people with circular heads and almost like a diamond-shaped body. They're almost in a cross-like form or arrangement with a blue figure in the middle, or a blue diamond-shaped body with a circular head in the middle. And it looks like there's 4 other figures sort of orthogonally placed around the points of the person, almost like they're looking in, which is really interesting because we did talk a lot about the gaze and sort of and it almost looks like the figure in the middle with the blue is maybe looking at us, the viewer. So that's what a powerful way to think about how we arrange ourselves. And even in this audience, I mean, I think a lot about, when I'm jumping on the bus, when you're riding on the bus, who's at the front, who's in the middle, who's in the back, who can actually get on and get off or see the other people because, your body's turned in a certain way. So, I mean, this is a really powerful.
And if I may add to that, Coralina, there's a sense of decentering, right? The person in the center is the person who has a disability, who has a color that's different, and everybody else is outside of that center, circling around. So maybe it's protective, maybe it's looking in. I think they can be seen from different perspectives, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. And yeah, if anyone else, we have quite a range of folks from, it seems like different backgrounds here. Are there any other words or images that folks want to share verbally in this moment where we're kind of culling our resources here? Or if there's words that we have heard today that might be triggering or difficult, or even if you have a story to tell or an experience to share. I mean, it's a good time to jump in, and we can also share anonymously too. So yeah.
I think one thing that didn't come up so much is sort of the emotional layer, right? We heard some things that are difficult experiences, but intellectually, I think we understand them, but the feeling behind them doesn't come up as much. And that might be sort of a cultural staring away from the emotion or the feeling behind it. So I would be interested in hearing, do you feel that it's challenging? Do you feel sad, frustrated, or maybe feeling numb? Like emotionally, we don't feel it when we listen to that story. So I think the emotion is also important to consider here.
I feel like the first 5 minutes, I was like almost breaking down in tears, just thinking about that time and that place of just, I think remembering and recalling what it was like to be just so isolated and feel so embarrassed. I mean, the shame was certainly sort of the kind of mental space that I was in when I was recalling, my first year recovering from my injuries and that trauma. But how, that resilience happened over the course of time, but also over many conversations and images. And I mean, one thing that everyone's familiar with, I think, is that, the visual culture around the ADA, like the disability parking sign, for example. I think another image or sensory experience I think that a lot of people are familiar with is Braille. I think, for example, when you go to an ATM, you usually see, you either feel or see that there's Braille there. So I think there's moments where folks who may not be a part of this community directly are engaging with these objects and these images directly. So it's good to think about that culture. Are you able to? Oh, wow. Okay. Grabbing bars in public bathrooms. Absolutely. One of the panelists suggested that. I think that's definitely something that we all either see or feel in the spaces around us. Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and sketch out some images. Elia, what are some other images that come to your mind when you're thinking about the ways in which we interact with like either images or like I said, objects, tactile things?
I think that's a really great question. I'm wondering if it's about images, but also if we can consider the senses. What are some things that we might hear as far as sounds?
Oh, yeah.
What are some things we see? What are some things we feel with our sense of touch? And I think that becomes really important if it's an announcement, if it's an alarm, if it's a sound that you hear, moments that you sort of notice that things become visible and unavoidable, but then sometimes we cancel that out after as well.
You know, we have a poster here that says Black Disabled Lives Matter. And this is a poster taken from a conference at NYU with an infinity sign on the wrist area with a fist, a power fist.
But
really,
the
and
Venn
some-
diagram of 3 different circles and having those intersections between them, between each 2 circles, and then 1 intersection amongst all. One of the circles says desirable, the second says viable,
turn
the
off the
third
video.
says feasible.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and all of those circles sort of live within a bigger circle that says systemic, transparent, and responsible.
Another image on the upper left, you can see hands being raised, almost like they're emerging from some kind of environment in different colors. So a green hand comes from a big wave of green. There's an orange hand rising up towards the ceiling of the image that is orange, and it's almost like a wave of orange. It's like hands waving. I think there's another image with, it looks like maybe a parent and their child with superhero capes on, and they're flying through the sky. That's pretty fascinating. And then there's an image of a compilation of logos that look like different, it says all ways, all is in caps and ways is in lowercase. It looks like there's one of an eye with a slash through it. There's one with headphones. There's one that almost looks like a brain that's cut in half. That's a really compelling one. It looks like there's a crutch, maybe a medicine bottle, a toilet, a walker. There's a service dog. There's also a question mark, actually, which was really interesting. There's also circles that are larger and smaller. There's a person with a cane. There's also a hand. It looks like a hand with 5 fingers and then little white dots. The hand is rendered in black, and then the white dots are sort of in the palm of the hand. So that's also really interesting. You have also, it looks like sign language hands. It looks like the pointer finger is touching the thumb finger, creating a circle. And then there's a second hand that's creating the same form, but it's mirrored. What else are we seeing here, Elia? A telephone with caption symbol, yeah, closed captioning. Some of the other words that have come up here. Able/guilt, helplessness. I mean, that's definitely a word that comes up in my mind, you know, when I think about having gone through some of these issues. And I mean, I guess I'll also say, like, the pandemic, I think this past year has really confronted a lot of people with the healthcare system in a way that a lot of people have never had to engage. So in some ways, you know, this moment of, you know, some people having access to vaccinations, others, it's very challenging to access those. And a lot of identity factors come into play to that. But I definitely think as a nation, we've had to confront these issues of access in just these very fundamental ways. Another Venn diagram here that says who was involved in the process, question mark, who was harmed, who benefited. Those are important questions. There's a circle with 4 hands making almost like a cross, but the hands are outstretched in kind of a cross form, where the knuckles are wrapping around north, south, east, west around this circle. And one end of the circle has people, another has cuts, another has against, another has disabled. The International Day of Persons with Disabilities logo is interesting because it's almost like There's a circle with sort of hands almost cradling underneath the circle.
Right, because it's the 1 in 5, and it's about visibility. So if we went about it this way, it would cover the visibility for us. It would cover the being seen. It would cover being gaze. It would cover gaze, and also inclusion. So that's one idea. That's also the 1 in 5 that way.
What Kevin first pointed to was it looks like a fist, but the number 1, the pointer finger is lifted up, almost making a number 1 gesture with the hand.
Yeah, I think that's,
And then
a really strong idea.
The second one is looking at the audience
If you can get
logo
this
that
shift-
you drew, where it's
No,
4
I think get this
circles
out of the way so we can just
in
do
a
this
cross
on
or a
site.
square, but then there's a
this
black
stuff
circle
out of
in the middle.
It looks like the Helvetica man, the same guy that you see whenever you see a bathroom sign or the Olympic icons, but the guy is taking flight with a cape on his back. So it's really focusing on ability. Everyone has their own agency. Everyone has their own their own force, their own fight, their own inner strength. So it's not really focusing on the person's disability. It's focusing on the person's ability. I think this is also a really strong one. This person taking flight. I remember when who was the artist who was showing the herself outside in front of
Jaklin.
Yeah. One of the comments that she made was that New York City was supposed to be inhospitable, and she just
Oh, that was Oaklee.
yeah, Oaklee, yeah. She said how New York City was inhospitable, but she went out of her way to make sure that she was going to fight against the structure of the thing and make sure that she created something that had a bit more inclusion. So I think this speaks to that idea. I think this is also a really strong idea over here, what Andrea came up with. If we could somehow create an eye, and then within the eye have the symbol for the disabled person with the wheelchair. So it would be nice if we could work the 1 in 5 into this. That may be a bit too finicky. But I do think Andrea's idea was strong with the eye itself for visibility and inclusion. So if we have the arc for the eye, and then after that, and Cora, you let me know if you think this is something that you could execute.
Yeah, I do think so. Kevin right now is sketching a what looks to be an eyelid, the top of an eyelid. It's kind of an arc shape in black marker, and then inside where the eyeball or pupil would be is a person in a wheelchair. It looks like. And I guess the question you're saying is, how do we integrate the data, the number 1 in 5?
Well, I wouldn't even go for that. I mean, I think what the real question is do you think that this is something that you could render?
Things that we do is think about these as bricks, and almost like triangular bricks. So
Oh yeah.
if you want to, for example, draw a line, you would just align sort of triangles into a shape
And if we can
that
picture
come
really quick,
together
and start to render these in the meantime.
in this way. Disembodied bodies come together in these kind of brick-like manner. Show the audience some of the sketches. We'll do our best to continue narrating what we've sketched. But we'd love for you to have some reactions and to kind of call in response.
You can just point at the one.
If you want to come up and point or just shout or raise hands, which one you like, or if you want a combination of certain images.
Anybody feel like this would be the strongest one? Any hands? This is the idea of the 1 in 5 pie. Just raise your hand. This is the idea of the raising the power fist, but with the one finger to represent the 1 in 5. Anybody with this one? A couple people. This is not sure about the symbols, but 1 in 5 is this person being isolated and on display within that circle.
We're looking at 4 circles that are white and then a black circle in the middle.
An eye with the symbol for handicap and great disability. 2 people for that one. So it's kind of between these two.
These two here. So over here we have the 1 in 5 idea, again with one finger being held up. It's the power fist, but then the one finger because the one is important, and it's about visibility. Yeah, so we're to vote between these two.
Okay, so who votes for the one fist? All right, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
All right, and then over here we have our eyeball, and then within the center of the eyeball where the pupil would be, we have the disability symbol. And this one here is about inclusion and about visibility, them being included and being visible and also being accounted for. All right, and we have
Three for that.
Yeah, three for that one. So it looks like we have a clear winner. One in 5.
Wait. I know Kevin wants us to get to an image which we're going to build. Any last arguments? Do we want to combine these in any way? Like constructive critique here, folks. If you see an image that you feel like you could combine or enhance what we're voting on, we can also do that. Does anyone want to shout out, and I'll repeat what folks say? Like, is there, I mean, one thing, for example, I saw in one of the other logos was a hands cradled. I don't know if we can think about how the hand is interacting with the full body that is in the wheelchair. You know, maybe there's some way that can happen.
Yeah, I think that hands cradled one was a really good idea.
Okay.
And from the hands, we ended up with these hands here.
Okay.
We kind of like coalesced it down to like one singular hand, because it is about ability.
Right.
And I think a hand says ability.
Okay. All right. So final vote. All right. So it's between one more comment. A what? Noelle had a great suggestion from the audience. She said, what if the person who is sitting in the wheelchair that is representing the pupil in this image has their arm up in either the fist or in the one symbol? Actually, I do think what we can render is the arm up.
Oh yeah.
So let's just add that real quick.
Here, Cora, there's a marker here.
I think we can do that. Okay. Is that a little bit?
Too soft?
Hold it up. Let's see. Is that a little bit? We'll see if we can render this with underwear. Maybe if we use some whale tails.
Yeah, like
on the finger.
Oh yeah,
I think we can do it with a thong.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
It's spring break.
Spring break in Miami.
Panty twisters. Okay. So we're kind of wrapping up, but it looks like we have a clear winner in terms of what the audience has designed here. And I guess we'll just fold it. And so for those who cannot see what's drawn here, it looks like there is an eye that's in dark black marker drawn on a white paper. There's a person who is sitting in a wheelchair that recalls the traditional ADA logo or sign that you might see in a parking lot, but that sign is instead representing the pupil of the eye. And so what we're going to do now, and this is what I encourage folks to come and touch and engage with the work physically, is we're going to create this logo that you all imagined here today with the underwear. And we're going to sort of wrap up the conversational component of this virtual exercise. And we're now going to, for the rest of this, just silently create the quilt with the underwear and create this logo. So I guess in the last sort of few minutes here, as we start to assemble the draws on the queen size bed sheet, I just want to thank everyone who has participated in the conversation, all speakers as well as audience who's engaged today, because this was extremely generative. It was such an evolution of the project, but also just so transformative for me as an artist to really think about the ways in which our city has changed, even since I first became disabled, as well as, you know, kind of coming back to Miami and coming from New York and sort of understanding those transitions. So I just want to encourage everyone to check out Disability Independence Group. If you'd like to learn more about advocacy and things that you can do in your community on a day-to-day basis, I encourage everyone here to go and learn ASL. There's some really cool things that we can just do to kind of create more access and just open ourselves up. I mean, in this moment where we're transitioning out of our confinement and isolation from the pandemic, to just stretch ourselves out wide, not stretching ourselves thin, but stretching ourselves out. And to really think about the Arpillera and the quilt as being kind of this colcha, or this embracer, this embracing element. And how do we embrace more folks with disability? How do we destigmatize sort of what we might be experiencing? What are those hidden things, and why are we hiding them? And so, yeah, thank you so much to the speakers, Oaklee, Jaklin, Matthew, Victoria, Elia, Kevin, Andrea. I'm Coralina Rodriguez Meyer. For the next 5 or so minutes, I'm calling you all up. We have gloves. We have, this is totally safe to touch without gloves, but whatever makes you feel comfortable. The speakers are now gonna put on our masks because we're gonna get closer to one another, and we're gonna assemble this image together. So I encourage you all to come and assemble. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And these last 5 minutes are gonna all be visual. Thank you.